If you're following J.K. Rowling on Twitter or are very active in the Harry Potter fandom, you've probably seen her recent tweets that are less than politically correct, to say the least. But that isn't the first time that she's had some slightly problematic beliefs, and they even show through in some of her work. I'm going to be focusing on Harry Potter today, specifically the Goblins and the House-Elves. As a disclaimer, I do not mean to say that J.K. Rowling purposefully made the Goblins and House-Elves seem like caricatures of Jewish people and slavery, respectively, but whether she did or not, I have no way to know that because I'm not her. But there are far too many parallels for it to be conceivably a coincidence, and this is just me reporting on what I have found, what other people have found, and how it reflects real life historically and even presently. The physical descriptions, as described in the first book, are... "Yeah, that's a goblin," said Hagrid quietly as they walked up the white stone steps toward him. The goblin was about a head shorter than Harry. He had a swarthy, clever face, a pointed beard, and, Harry noticed, very long fingers and feet. The clever, swarthy face is represented in caricatures of Jewish people, and as well as the long fingers. And if that weren't enough, I don't know if it's ever described in the books, but the movie depictions of the goblins also have rather large noses and receding hairlines, which is... it's very common in anti-Semitic caricatures for Jewish people to have large noses, receding hairlines, the little pointed goatee thing, which is described in that quote. They work in the Wizarding Bank Gringotts, which... a very common anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is the Jews control the banks theory. There are a lot of pieces of propaganda that depict Jewish people as a puppet master with government officials as the marionette, and also Jewish people being greedy, controlling the banks, having all the money was also commonly used as a scapegoat in Nazi Germany, as this is why the economy is crashing, is because these Jewish people have all the money. In the 7th book, on page 516, in a conversation between Bill Weasley and Harry himself, quote, "I have to say this," Bill went on, "if you have struck any kind of bargain with Griphook, and most particularly if that bargain involves treasure, you must be exceptionally careful. Goblin notions of ownership, payment, and repayment are not the same as human ones." Harry felt a slight squirm of discomfort, as though a small snake had stirred inside him. "What do you mean?" he asked. "We are talking about a different breed of being," said Bill. "Dealings between wizards and goblins have been fraught for centuries, but you'll know that from history of magic. There is a belief among some goblins, and those at Gringotts are perhaps most prone to it, that wizards cannot be trusted in matters of gold and treasure, that they have no respect for goblin ownership." So, the goblins not trusting the wizards and the wizards not trusting the goblins is a pretty common theme throughout the books. And the untrustworthiness and the greed are both very common in Jewish caricatures from all of history, and even some now in things like political cartoons. Griphook was unexpectedly bloodthirsty, laughed at the idea of pain in lesser creatures, and seemed to relish the possibility that they might have to hurt other wizards in order to reach the Lestrange vault. Jewish people being bloodthirsty was sometimes used in propaganda, as well as ways to stir up distrust between Gentile and Jewish people in Nazi Germany. The idea that your Jewish friends, your Jewish neighbors, would possibly backstab you at any point in time was definitely a thing that was used. And the references to goblins being bloodthirsty there are definitely parallels there. A lot of this with the goblins is things that wouldn't be even questionable in some cases on its own, but combining their physical characteristics with the greediness, with the bloodthirstiness, with the running the bank. All of that culminates into the idea that this doesn't seem like it could be a coincidence. And like I said in my little disclaimer, I have no way to know if this was J.K. Rowling's intention. As for the House-Elves, physically and with their behavior, there is a lot less that specifically connects them to a racial minority or an oppressed group. However, the way they are enslaved and the way they treat their slavery and talk about it is not good. It's rather problematic. House elves are not paid and have no benefits. And all the house elves that we interact with in the stories, we being the characters, that the characters interact with in the books and in the movies, are very much okay with that. They don't want to be paid. They would rather not be paid. They willingly punish themselves when they accidentally or purposefully go against their master's orders. And there's really only one house elf that challenges that, which is Dobby, who shows up for the first time in the second book against his master's orders in an attempt to keep Harry from going to Hogwarts, knowing that he is in danger if he goes. And all the other house elves that we see later in the books, primarily in the fourth book, Goblet of Fire, they treat Dobby like he is strange, like he's weird, like this is a phase that he'll get over at some point and settle down not being paid and following his master's orders. For instance, in the fourth book, in a conversation with Winky, Barty Crouch's house elf, on page 98, she says, quote, "House elves is not paid, sir," she said in a muffled squeak. No, I says to Dobby, I says, "Go find yourself a nice family and settle down, Dobby. He is getting up to all sorts of hijinks, sir, what is unbecoming of a house elf." Winky is not just judgmental or judgmental or disagreeing with the way Dobby lives and wants payment and leave and etc. She's almost personally offended by it. Like, it goes against everything that house elves are, and in a way it does, but it's very common in fiction for there to be a slave race that is okay with or enjoying their slavery. And I feel like that's a trope that we just need to let die. Because while slavery is definitely less widespread and illegal in almost everywhere than it was in, say, pre-Civil War America and things like that, it still exists. And there are still people who think it should exist, even in places it is completely illegal and is very unlikely for anyone to run into it. And in having these lesser beings that are enjoying their enslavement, and the ones that don't want to be enslaved or find ways to be freed are judged not only by others of that particular species of creature, but also even by the wizards of Harry Potter. For instance, again, in the fourth book, page 182, Hermione, in a conversation with nearly headless Nick, says, But they get paid, she said? They get holidays, don't they? And sick leave and pensions and everything? Nearly headless Nick chortled so much that his ruff slipped and his head flopped off, dangling on the inch or so of ghostly skin and muscle that still attached it to his neck. "Sick leave and pensions," he said, pushing his head back onto his shoulders and securing it once more with his ruff. House elves don't want sick leave and pensions. But even nearly headless Nick, who, while we're not entirely sure as to when he died and thus when he lived, has been a Hogwarts ghost for a very long time. I believe it is canonically around 300 years. as a ghost, and that isn't even including his possible time as a ghost pre-Hogwarts, as well as his actual life before he got nearly beheaded. So obviously this is a very set in its ways, this is tradition, and so it makes sense that the older wizards would perhaps not be, well, this is tradition, this is how it's always been. But the combination of the House-Elves seeming to enjoy their slavery, as well as Dobby being looked down upon for being freed and asking for pay, and things like that, as well as Hermione being almost exiled in some places in Hogwarts for her attempts to free them, and even Harry and Ron, who are her best friends, they stopped talking to her a while because of her want to help the House-Elves, and they call her overbearing and generally just aren't very good to her. And again, I don't know if this was Rowling's intention. I have no way to know that because I am not her. On top of all of that, we have Fred and George in a conversation with Hermione on page 239 of Book 4. Quote, "Listen, have you ever been down to the kitchens, Hermione?" "No, of course not," says Hermione, curtly. "I hardly think students are supposed to." "Well, we have," said George, indicating Fred. "Loads of times, to nick food. And we've met them, and they're happy. They think they've got the best job in the world. That's because they're uneducated and brainwashed," Hermione began hotly. And so, people that don't know Hermione that well, but are still her friends, like Fred and George, they seem to feel like they're doing her a favor by explaining to her why the House-Elves enjoy it and why it's okay and that the House-Elves enjoy it. And the way that pretty much all of the characters, aside from Dobby and in some cases Dumbledore, are seeing this like it's strange and unnatural and not the order of things and how they're supposed to be. It's very condescending, very patronizing, and that definitely does play into the way that everyone really treats Hermione and a lot of the other female characters in the Harry Potter books. But also, it really says how much of a tradition, how much of an oppressive system that everyone is almost working to uphold that this is. And while I do feel that showing things like that in fiction can be very good, very helpful to activism, the fact that the House-Elves aren't free by the end of the series and aren't even improving their conditions by the end of the series, really, and in fact are basically just never mentioned again after Dobby's death in the 7th book, elves were freed by the end. I would honestly be applauding that for pioneering this trope in a way that hasn't really been done very often in fiction, fantasy, science fiction, but because they aren't freed, it's really just upholding a system and again increasing stigma and biases. And so there are much better ways to have written the House-Elves, either from the beginning or the way that they are treated in the 7th book towards the end, as the Death Eaters and the Ministry of Magic is taken over by Voldemort and his supporters. Treating the House-Elves cruelly at that point makes sense narratively, but the fact that they're never mentioned again doesn't, because Kingsley, as acting Prime Minister, it mentions a few of the things he does, like removing the restrictions on Muggle-born wizards, and I believe he also helps the Goblins in some way. But again, House-Elves are literally not mentioned past, I believe there's one line in the Battle of Hogwarts, and other than that, once Dobby's dead, they're just gone. Like, not mentioned again at all. And so, even a throwaway line about Kingsley having freed them would have been so much better than what we have, but that is not what happens, and in that the House-Elves aren't freed at the end of the base series, or even really mentioned in Cursed Child, which is technically canon post Harry Potter. So the fact that Rowling doesn't even show that they could have been freed or that they were freed it really just upholds the trope again, and it's not a great way to do it. And like I said, this is a common theme in a lot of fiction, specifically fantasy and science fiction, but it really shouldn't be, in my personal opinion. It really is something that we just need to leave in the past. There are places where it would have made a lot of narrative sense to have the House-Elves freed or have their situation be improving as a whole, but there aren't. And in fact, they are just treated like they never really existed past a certain point. So, definitely not as pressing, as I would say, as the issue of the goblins, but still a thing.